Mort, Part 12. Albert sat on his narrow bed, glowering at the wall. He heard the sound of hoofbeats abruptly cut off as Binky got airborne and muttered underneath his breath. 20 minutes passed. Expressions flitted across the old wizard's face like cloud shadows across a hillside. Occasionally he'd whisper something to himself like, "I told him," or "never would have stood for it," or "the master ought to be told." Eventually he seemed to reach an agreement with himself, knelt down gingerly and pulled a battered trunk from his bed. He opened it with difficulty and unfolded a dusty grey robe that scattered mothballs and tarnished sequins across the floor. He pulled on it, brushed off the worst of the dust, and crawled under the bed again. There was a lot of muffled cursing and the occasional clink of china, and finally Albert emerged, holding a staff taller than he was. It was thicker than any normal staff, mainly because of the carvings that covered it from top to bottom. They were actually quite indistinct, but gave the impression that if you could see them better, you would regret it. Albert brushed himself down again and examined himself critically in the washstand mirror. Then he said, "Hat? No hat. Got to have a hat for the wizarding. Damn." He stamped out of the room and returned after a busy 15 minutes, which included a circular hole cut out of a carpet in Mort's bedroom, the silver paper taken out from behind the mirror in Isabel's room, a needle and thread from the box under the sink in the kitchen, and a few loose sequins scraped up from the bottom of the robe chest. The end result was not as good as he would have liked, and tended to slip rakishly over one eye. But it was black and had stars and moons all over it, and proclaimed its owner to be, without any shadow of a doubt, a wizard, although possibly a slightly desperate one. He felt probably dressed for the first time in 2,000 years. It was a disconcerting feeling and cost him a second's reflection before he kicked aside the rag rug beside the bed and used the staff to draw a circle on the floor. When the tip of the staff passed, it left a line of glowing octarine, the eighth color of the spectrum, the color of magic, the pigment of imagination. He marked 8 points on its circumference and joined them to form an octagram. A low throbbing began to fill the room. Alberto Malich stepped into the center and held the staff above his head. He felt it wake to his grip, felt the tingle of the sleeping power unfold itself slowly and deliberately, like a waking tiger. It triggered old memories of power and magic that buzzed through the cobweb attics of his mind. He felt alive for the first time in centuries. He licked his lips, and the throbbing had died away, leaving a strange, waiting kind of silence. Malich raised his head and shouted one single syllable. Blue-green fire flashed from both ends of the staff. Streams of octarine flame sprouted from the 8 points of the octagram and enveloped the wizard. All this wasn't actually necessary to accomplish the spell, but wizards consider appearances are very important. So are disappearances. He vanished. Stratohemispheric winds whipped at Mort's cloak. "Where are we going first?" yelled Isabel in his ear. "Best pelagic," shouted Mort, the gale whirling his words away. "Where's that?" "Agagian Empire, counterweight continent." He pointed downward. He wasn't forcing Binky at the moment, knowing the miles that lay ahead, and the big white horse was currently running at an easy gallop out over the ocean. Isabel looked down at the roaring green waves, topped with white foam, and clung tighter to Mort. Mort peered ahead at the cloud bank that marked the distant continent and resisted the urge to hurry Binky along with the flat of his sword. He'd never struck the horse and wasn't at all confident about what would happen if he did. All he could do was wait. A hand appeared under his arm holding a sandwich. "There's a ham or cheese and chutney," she said. "You might as well eat. There's nothing else to do." Mort looked down at the soggy triangle and tried to remember when he last had a meal. Some time beyond the reach of a clock, anyway. He'd need a calendar to calculate. He took the sandwich. "Thanks," he said, as graciously as he could manage. The tiny sun rolled down toward the horizon, towing its lazy daylight behind it. The clouds ahead grew and became outlined in pink and orange. After a while he could make out the darker blur of land below them, with here and there the lights of a city. Half an hour later he was sure he could see the individual buildings, Agagian architecture inclined toward squat pyramids. Binky lost height until his hooves were barely a few feet above the sea. Mort examined the hourglass again and gently tugged on the reins to direct the horse toward a seaport a little rimwards of the present course. There were a few ships at anchor, mostly single-sail coastal traders. The empire didn't encourage its subjects to go far away in case they saw things that they might find disturbing. For the same reason, it had built a wall around the entire country, patrolled by the Heavenly Guard, whose main function was to tread heavily on the fingers of any inhabitants who they felt like to step outside for 5 minutes for a breath of fresh air. This didn't happen often because most of the subjects of the Sun Emperor were quite happy to live inside the wall. It's a fact of life that everyone is on one side or another of a wall, so the only thing to do is forget about it or evolve stronger fingers. "Who runs this place?" said Isabel as they passed over the harbour. "There's some kind of boy emperor," said Mort, "but the top man is really the Grand Vizier, I think." "Never trust a Grand Vizier," said Isabel wisely. In fact, the Sun Emperor didn't. The Vizier, whose name was Nine Turning Mirrors, had some very clear views about who should run the country, e.g. it should be him. And now the boy was getting big enough to ask questions like, "Don't you think the wall will look better with a few gates in it?" And, "Yes, but what is it like on the other side?" He had decided that in the Emperor's own best interest, he should be painfully poisoned and buried in quicklime. Binky landed on the raked gravel outside the low, many-roomed palace, severely rearranging the harmony of the universe. The stone garden of the universal peace and simplicity laid out to the orders of the old Emperor One Sun Mirror used economy of position and shadow to symbolize the basic unity of soul and matter and the harmony of all things. It was said the secrets at the very heart of reality lay hidden in the precise ordering of its stones. Emperor One Sun Mirror, whose other claim to fame was his habit of cutting off his enemies' lips and legs and then promising them their freedom if they could run through the city playing a trumpet. The young Sun Emperor was sitting cross-legged at the head of the mat with his cloak of vermin and feathers spread out behind him. He looked as though he was outgrowing it. The rest of the court was sitting around the mat in strict, complicated order of precedence, but there was no mistaking the Vizier, who was tugging into his bowl of squishy and boiled seaweed in a highly suspicious fashion. No one seemed about to die. Mort passed along in the passage, turned the corner, and nearly walked into several large members of the Heavenly Guard who were clustered around a spy hole in the paper wall and passing a cigarette from hand to hand in that palm-cupped way of soldiers on duty. He tiptoed back to the lattice and overheard the conversation thus. "I am the most unfortunate of mortals, O imminent presence, to find such as this in my otherwise satisfactory squishy," said the Vizier, extending his chopsticks. The court craned to see, and so did Mort. Mort couldn't help agreeing with the statement, though. The thing was a sort of blue-green lump with rubbery tubes dangling from it. "The preparer of food will be disciplined, noble personage of scholarship," said the Emperor. "Who got the spare ribs?" "No, O perceptive father of your people, I was referring to the fact that this is, I believe, the bladder and spleen of the deep-water puff eel, allegedly the most tasty of morsels to the extent that it may only be eaten by those beloved of the gods themselves, or so it is written. Among such company, of course, I do not include my miserable self." With a deft flick he transported it to the bowl of the Emperor, where it wobbled to a standstill. The boy looked at it for some time and then skewered it with a chopstick. "Ah," he said, "but is it not also written by none other than the great philosopher Lai Tin Weedle that a scholar may be ranked above princes? I seem to remember you giving me the passage to read once, O faithful and assiduous seeker of knowledge." The thing followed another brief arch through the air and flopped apologetically into the Vizier's bowl. He scooped it up in a quick movement and poised it for a second service. His eyes narrowed. "Such may be generally the case, O Jade River of Wisdom, but specifically I cannot be ranked above the Emperor, whom I love as my own son, and have done ever since his late father's unfortunate death, and thus I lay this small offering at your feet." The eyes of the court followed the wretched organ on its third flight across the mat, but the Emperor snatched up his fan and brought it off with a magnificent volley that ended back in the Vizier's bowl with such a force that it sent up a spray of seaweed. "Somebody eat it, for heaven's sake," shouted Mort, totally unhurt. "I'm in a hurry." "Thou art indeed the most thoughtful of servants, O devoted and indeed only companion of my late father and great-grandfather when they passed over, and therefore I decree that your reward shall be this most rare and exquisite of morsels." The Vizier prodded the thing uncertainly and looked into the Emperor's smile. It was bright and terrible. He fumbled for an excuse. "Alas, it would seem that I have already eaten far too much," he began, but the Emperor waved him into silence. "Doubtless it requires suitable seasoning," he said, and clapped his hands. The wall behind him ripped from top to bottom, and 4 heavenly guards stepped through, 3 of them brandishing Kando swords, the 4th hurriedly trying to swallow a lighted dog end. The vizier's bowl dropped from his hands. "My most faithful of servants believes he has no space left for this final mouthful," said the Emperor. "Doubtless you can investigate his stomach to see if this is true. Why has that man got smoke coming out of his ears?" "Anxious for action, O Sky Eminence," said the sergeant quickly. "No stopping him, I'm afraid." "Then let him take his knife and— Oh, the vizier seems to be hungry after all. Well done." There was absolute silence while the vizier's cheeks bulged rhythmically. Then he gulped. "Delicious," he said. "Superb. Truly the food of the gods. And now, if you will excuse me," he unfolded his legs and made as if to stand up. Little beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. "You wish to depart," said the Emperor, raising his eyebrows. "Pressing matters of state, O perspicacious personage of— Be seated. Rising so soon after meals can be bad for the digestion," said the Emperor, and the guards nodded in agreement. "Besides, there are no urgent matters of state unless you refer to those in the small red bottle marked antidote in the black lacquered cabinet on the bamboo rug in your quarters, O lamp of midnight oil." There was a ringing in the vizier's ears. His face began to go blue. "You see," said the Emperor, "untimely activity on a heavy stomach is conducive to ill humors. May this message go swiftly to all corners of my country, that all men may know of your unfortunate condition and derive instruction thereby. I must congratulate your personage on such consideration," said the vizier, and fell forward into a dish of boiled soft-shell crabs. "I had an excellent teacher," said the Emperor. "About time too," said Mort, and swung the sword. A moment later, the soul of the vizier got up from the mat and looked Mort up and down. "Who are you, barbarian?" "Death." "And not my death," said the vizier firmly. "Where's the black celestial dragon of fire?" "He couldn't come," said Mort. There were shadows forming in the air behind the vizier's soul. Several of them wore the Emperor's robes, but there were plenty of others jostling them, and they all looked most anxious to welcome the newcomer to the lands of the dead. "I think there's some people here to see you," said Mort, and hurried away. As he reached the passageway, the vizier's soul started to scream. Isabel was standing patiently by Binky, who was making a late lunch of a 500-year-old bonsai tree. "One down," said Mort, climbing into the saddle. "Come on, I've got a bad feeling about the next one, and we haven't got much time." Albert materialized in the center of Unseen University, in the same place, in fact, from which he had departed the world some 2,000 years before. He grunted with satisfaction and brushed a few specks of dust off of his robe. He became aware that he was being watched. On looking up, he discovered that he had flashed into existence under the stern marble gaze of himself. He adjusted his spectacles and peered disapprovingly at the bronze plaque screwed to his pedestal. It said, "Alberto Malich, founder of this university, AM 1222 to 1289. We will not see his like again." So much for prediction, he thought, and if they thought so much of him, they could at least have hired a decent sculptor. It was disgraceful. The nose was all wrong. Call that a leg? People have been carving their names on it too. He would have been seen dead with a head like that either. Of course, if he could help it, he wouldn't be seen dead at all. Albert aimed an octarine thunderbolt at the ghastly thing and grinned evilly as it exploded into dust. "Right," he said to the disc at large. "I'm back." The tingle from the magic coursed all the way up his arm and started a warm glow in his mind. How he'd missed it, all these years. Wizards came hurrying through the big double doors at the sound of the explosion and cleared the wrong conclusion from the standing start. There was the pedestal empty. There was a cloud of marble dust over everything, and striding out of it, muttering to himself, was Albert. The wizards at the back of the crowd started to have it away as quietly as possible. There wasn't one of them that hadn't at some time in his jolly youth put a common bedroom utensil on old Albert's head, or carved his name somewhere on the statue's chilly anatomy, or spilled beer on the pedestal. Worse than that too, during Rag Week, when the drink flowed quickly and the privy seemed too far to stagger, these had all seemed hilarious ideas at the time. They most certainly did not now. Only 2 figures remained to face the statue's wrath, one because he got his robe caught in the door, and the other one because he was in fact an ape and could therefore take a relaxed attitude to human affairs. Albert grabbed the wizard who was trying to desperately crawl in to walk into a wall. The man squealed. All right, I admit it. I was drunk at the time. Believe me, I didn't mean it. Gosh, I'm sorry. What are you bleating about, man? Said Albert, genuinely puzzled. So sorry I tried to tell you how sorry I am. Stop this bloody nonsense. Albert glanced down at the little ape, who gave him a warm, friendly smile. What's your name, man? Yes, sir. I'll stop right away. No more nonsense, sir. Rincewind, sir. Assistant librarian, if it's all right by you. Albert looked him up and down. The man had a desperate, scoffed look, like something left out of the laundry. He decided that if this was what wizarding had come to, someone ought to do something about it. What sort of librarian would have you for assistant? He demanded irritably. Okay. Something like a warm, soft leather glove tried to hold his hand. A monkey in my university. Orangutan, sir. He used to be a wizard but got caught in some magic, sir. Now he won't let us turn him back, and he's the only one who knows where all the books are, said Rincewind urgently. I look after his bananas, he added, feeling some additional explanation was called for. Albert glared at him. Shut up. Shutting up right away, sir. And tell me where Death is. Death, sir, said Rincewind, backing against the wall. Tall, skeletal, blue eyes, talks like this. Death, seen him lately? Rincewind swallowed. Not lately, sir. Well, I want him. This nonsense has got to stop. I'm going to stop it now, see? I want the 8 most senior wizards assembled here, right, in half an hour with all the necessary equipment to perform the rite of Ashk Ente. Is that understood? Not that the sight of you lot gives me any confidence. Bunch of panty wasters, the lot of you. Stop trying to hold my hand. Okay. And now I'm going to the pub, snapped Albert. Do they sell any halfway decent cat's piss anywhere these days? There's the drum, sir, said Rincewind. The Broken Drum, in Filigree Street. Still there. Well, they changed the name sometimes and rebuilt it completely, but the site has been, on the site for years. I expect you're pretty dry, eh, sir? Rincewind said with an air of ghastly camaraderie. What would you know about it, said Albert sharply. Absolute nothing, sir, said Rincewind promptly. I'm going to the drum, then. Half an hour, mind. If they're not waiting for me when I come back, then, well, they just better be. He stormed out of the hall in a cloud of marble dust. Rincewind watched him go. The librarian held his hand. You know the worst of it, said Rincewind. Whoop! I don't even remember walking under a mirror. About the time Albert was in the mended drum, arguing with the landlord over a yellowing bar tap that had been handed down carefully from father to son through one regicide, 3 civil years, 61 major fires, 490 robberies, and more than 15,000 barroom balls, to record the fact that Alberto Malich still owed the management 3 copper pieces plus interest, currently standing at the contest of most of the disk's larger strong rooms, which proved once again that an Ankian merchant with an unpaid bill has the kind of memory that would make an elephant blink. At about this time, Binky was leaving a vapor trail in the skies above the great and mysterious continent of Qa'Rajh. Far below, drums sounded in the scented shadowy jungles, and columns of curling mist rose from hidden rivers where nameless beasts lurked under the surface and waited for supper to walk by. There's no more cheese. You'll have to have the ham, said Isabel. What's that light over there? The light dams, said Mort. We're getting closer. He pulled the hourglass out of his pocket and checked the level of sand. But not close enough, damn it. The light dams lay like pools of light upwards of their course, which is exactly what they were. Some of the tribes constructed mirror walls in the desert mountains to collect the disk sunlight, which is slow and slightly heavy. It was used here as currency. Binky glided over the campfires of the nomads and the silent marshes of the Salt River. Ahead of them, dark, familiar shapes began to reveal themselves in the moonlight. The pyramids of salt by moonlight, breathed Isabel. How romantic. Mortared with the blood of thousands of slaves, observed Mort. Please don't. I'm sorry, but the practical fact of the matter is that these... All right, you made your point, said Isabel irritably. It's a lot of effort to go through to bury a dead king, said Mort, as they circled above one of the smaller pyramids. They fill them full of preservative, you know, so they'll survive into the next world. Does it work? Not noticeably. Mort leaned over Binky's net. Torches down here, he said. Hang on. A procession was winding away from the avenue of pyramids, led by a giant statue of Ofra, the crocodile god, borne by 100 sweating slaves. Binky cantered above it entirely unnoticed and performed a perfect 4-point landing on the hard-packed sand outside the pyramid's entrance. "They've pickled another king," said Mort. He examined the glass again in the moonlight. It was quite plain, not the sort normally associated with royalty. "That can't be him," said Isabel. "They don't pickle them when they are still alive, do they?" "I hope not, because I read where, before they do the preserving, they, cut them open and remove." "I don't want to hear it. All the soft bit," Mort concluded lamely. "It's just as well the pickling doesn't work, really. Just imagine having to walk around with no—" "It isn't the king you've come to take," said Isabel loudly. "Who is it then?" Mort turned toward the dark entrance. It wouldn't be sealed until dawn, to give time for the dead king's soul to leave. It looked deep and foreboding, hinting at purposes considerably more dire than, say, keeping a razor blade nice and sharp. "Let's find out," he said. "Look out, he's coming back!" The university's 8 most senior wizards shuffled into line and tried to smooth out their beards, and in general made an unsuccessful effort to look presentable. It wasn't easy. They had been snatched from their workrooms or a post-prandial brandy in front of a roaring fire or quiet contemplation under a handkerchief in a comfy chair somewhere, and all of them were feeling extremely apprehensive and rather bewildered. They kept glancing at the empty pedestal. Only one creature could have duplicated the expressions on their faces, and that would be a pigeon who has heard not only that Lord Nelson has got down off his column, but has also been seen buying a 12-ball repeater and a box of cartridges. "He's coming up the corridor," shouted Rincewind, and dived behind a pillar. The assembled mages watched the big double doors as if they were about to explode, which shows how much prescient they were, because they did explode. Matchstick-sized bits of oak rained down among them, and a small, thin figure stood outlined against the light. It held a smoking staff in one hand. The other held a small, yellow toad. "Rincewind!" bawled Albert. "Sir, take this thing away and dispose of it." The toad crawled into Rincewind's hand and gave him an apologetic look. "That's the last time that bloody landlord gives any lip to a wizard," said Albert with smug satisfaction. "It seems I turned my back for a few 100 years, and suddenly people in this town are encouraged to think they can all talk back to wizards, eh?" One of the senior wizards mumbled something. "What was that? Speak up, man." "As the bursar of this university, I must say that we've always encouraged a good neighbor policy with respect to the community," mumbled the wizard, trying to avoid Albert's grim-lit stare. He had an upturned chamber pot on his conscience, with 3 cases of obscene graffiti to be taken into consideration. Albert let his mouth drop open. "Why?" "Well, a sense of civic duty. We feel it's vitally important that we show an The wizard tried desperately to beat out the flames in his beard. Albert lowered his staff and looked slowly along the row of mages. They swayed away from his stare like grass in a gale. "Anyone else want to show a sense of civic duty?" he said. "Good neighbors, anybody?" He drew himself up to his full height. "You spineless maggot, I didn't found this university so that you can lend the people your bloody lawnmower. What's the use of having power if you don't wield it? Man doesn't show you respect, you don't leave enough of his damn inn to roast chestnuts on. Is that understood?" Something like a soft sigh went up from the assembled wizards. They stared sadly at the toad in Rincewind's hand. Most of them, in the days of their youth, had mastered the art of getting rascally drunk at the drum. Of course, all of that was behind them now, but the Guild of Merchants' annual knife and fork supper would have been held in the drum's upstairs room the following evening, and all the 8 level wizards had been sent complimentary tickets. There were in a roast swan and 2 kinds of trifle, and lots of fraternal toast, too, our esteemed, nay, distinguished guests, until it was time for the college porters to turn up with the wheelbarrows. Albert strutted along the row, poking the occasional paunch with his staff. His mind danced and sang. Go back? Never. This was power. This was living. He'd challenge the old Boniface and spit in his empty eye. "By the smoking mirror of Grissom, there's going to be a few changes around here." Those wizards who had studied history nodded uncomfortably. It would be back to the stone floors and getting up when it was still dark, and no alcohol under any circumstances, and memorizing the true names of everything until the brain squeaked. What was that man doing? A wizard who had absent-mindedly reached for his tobacco pouch let the half-formed cigarette fall from his trembling fingers. It bounced when it hit the floor, and all the wizards watched it roll with longing eyes until Albert stepped forward smartly and squashed it. Albert spun around. Rincewind, who had been following him as a sort of unofficial adjutant, nearly walked into him. "You, Rince thing, do you smoke?" "No, sir, filthy habit." Rincewind avoided the gaze of his superiors. He was suddenly aware that he had made some lifelong enemies, and it was no consolation to know that he probably wouldn't have them for very long. "Right, hold my staff. Now, you bunch of miserable backsliders, this is going to stop. Do you hear? First thing tomorrow up at dawn, 3 times round the quadrangle and back here for physical jerks. Balanced meals, study, healthy exercise, and that bloody monkey goes to a circus first thing." "Wook!" Several of the older wizards shut their eyes. "But first," said Albert, lowering his voice, "you'll oblige me by setting up the rite of Ashk-Inte. I have some unfinished business," he said. Mort strode through the cat-black corridors of the pyramid, with Isabel hurrying along behind him. The faint glow from his sword illuminated unpleasant things. Offla, the crocodile god, was a cosmetics advert compared to some of the things the people of Sword worshipped. In alcoves along the way were statues of creatures apparently built of all the bits that God had left over. "What are they here for?" whispered Isabel. "The Sortian priests say they come alive when the pyramid is sealed and prowl the corridors to protect the body of the king from tomb robbers," said Mort. "What a horrible superstition." "Who said anything about superstition?" said Mort absently. "They really come alive? All I say is that when Sortians put a curse on a place, they do not mess about in casting it." Mort turned a corner and Isabel lost sight of him for a heart-stopping moment. She scurried through the darkness and cannoned into him. He was examining a dog-headed bird. "Ah," she said, "doesn't it send shivers up your spine?" "No," said Mort flatly. "Why not?" "Because I am Mort." He turned, and she saw his eyes glow like blue pinpoints. "Stop it." "I can't." She tried to laugh, but it didn't work. "You're not Death, you're only doing Death's job," she said. "Death is whoever does Death's job." The shocked pause that followed this was broken by a groan from further along the passage. Mort turned on his heel and hurried towards it. "He's right," thought Isabel, "even the way he moves." But the fear of the darkness that the light was dragging towards her overcame any other doubts, and she crept after him, around another corner and into what appeared in the fitful glow from the sword to be a cross between a treasury and a very cluttered attic. "What is this place?" she whispered. "I've never seen so much stuff." "The king takes it with him to the next world," said Mort. "He certainly doesn't believe in traveling light. Look, there's a whole boat and a gold bathtub." "Doubtless he will wish to keep clean when he gets there." "And all those statues?" "Those statues, I'm sorry to say, were people, servants for the king, you understand." Isabel's face said grimly, "The priest gave them poison." There was another groan from the other side of the cluttered room. Mort followed it to his source, stepping awkwardly over the rolls of carpet, bunches of dates, crates of crockery, and piles of gems. The king obviously hadn't been able to decide what he was going to leave behind on his journey, so had decided to play it safe and take everything. "Only it doesn't always work quickly," Mort added somberly. Isabel clambered gamely behind him and peered over a canoe at a young girl sprawled across a pile of rocks. She was wearing gauze trousers, a waistcoat cut from not enough material, and enough bangles to moor a decent-sized ship. There was a green stain around her mouth. "Does it hurt?" said Isabel quietly. "No. They think it takes them to paradise." "Does it?" "Maybe. Who knows?" Mort took the hourglass out of an inner pocket and inspected it by the gleam of the sword. He seemed to be counting to himself, and then with a sudden movement tossed the glass over his shoulder and brought the sword down with his other hand. The girl's shade sat up, stretched, with a clink of ghostly jewelry. She caught sight of Mort and bowed her head. "My lord!" "No one's lord," said Mort. "Now run along to wherever you believe you are going." "I shall be a concubine at the heavenly court of King Setherfoot, who will dwell among the stars forever," she said firmly. "You don't have to be," said Isabel sharply. The girl turned to her wide-eyed. "Oh, but I must. I've been training for it," she said, as she faded from view. "I've only managed to be a handmaiden up till now." She vanished. Isabel stared with dark disapproval at the space she had occupied. "Well," she said, "and did you see what she had on?" "Let's get out of here." "But it can't be true about King Hoose's dwelling among the stars," she grumbled as they found the way out of the crowded room. "There's nothing but empty space up there." "It's hard to explain," said Mort. "He'll dwell amongst the stars in his own mind." "What, with slaves?" If that's what they think they are. That's not very fair. There's no justice, said Mort. Just us. They hurried back along the avenues of waiting ghouls and were nearly running when they burst out into the desert night air. Isabel leaned against the rough stonework and panted for breath. Mort wasn't out of breath, as he wasn't breathing. I will take you wherever you want, he said, and then I must leave you. But I thought you wanted to rescue the princess. Mort shook his head. I have no choice. There are no choices. She ran forward and grabbed his arm as he turned towards the waiting Pinky. He removed her hand gently. I have finished my apprenticeship. It's all in your own mind, yelled Isabel. You're whatever you think you are. She stopped and looked down. The sand around Mort's feet was beginning to whip up in little spurts and twisting dust devils. There was a crackle in the air and a greasy feel. Mort looked uneasy. Someone is performing the rite of ash. And then it hit like a hammer. A force from out of the sky that blew the sand into a crater. There was a low buzzing and the smell of hot tin. Mort looked around himself in the gale rushing sand, turning as if in a dream, alone in the calm center of the gale. Lightning flashed in the whirling cloud. Deep inside his own mind he struggled to break free, but something had him in its grip, and he could no more resist than a compass needle can ignore the compulsion point towards the hub. At last he found what he was searching for. It was a doorway edged in octarine light, leading to a short tunnel. There were figures at the other end beckoning to him. I come, he said, and then turned as he heard the sudden noise behind him. 11 stone of young womanhood hit him squarely in the chest, lifting him off the ground. Mort landed with Isabel kneeling on him, holding on grimly to his arms. Let me go, he intoned. I have been summoned. Not you, idiot. She stared into the blue pupilless pools of his eyes. It was like looking down a rushing tunnel. Mort arched his back and screamed a curse so ancient and virulent that in the strong magical field it actually took on a form and flapped its leathery wings and slunk away. A private thunderstorm crashed around the sand dunes. His eyes drew her again. She looked away before she dropped like a stone a well made of blue light. I command you. Mort's voice could have cut holes in a rock. Father tried that tone on me for years, she said calmly, generally when he wanted me to clean my bedroom. It didn't work then either. Mort screamed another curse, which flopped out of the air and tried to bury itself in the sand. The pain! It's all in your head, she said, bracing herself against the force that wanted to drag them towards that flickering doorway. You're not death. You're just Mort. You're whatever you think you are. You're whatever I think you are. In the center of the blurred blueness of his eyes were 2 tiny brown dots rising at the speed of sight. The storm around them rose and wailed, and Mort screamed.